Tuesday, October 14th, 6:15 in the morning. I remember the exact minute because I was standing in my driveway with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand when my phone buzzed against the porch railing. I just backed my truck out to head to the warehouse, same as I had every weekday morning for the last 31 years. And something told me to check that message before I put the truck in gear. I had no idea that in the next 6 minutes, everything I believed about my own family was going to come undone right there in that driveway. I'm going to tell you exactly what that message said, and what I found when I looked, and what I did about it, because I didn't raise my voice and I didn't slam a single door, and by the time it was over, I didn't need to. If you're listening to this on your way to work, or in your recliner with your coffee, or sitting in a hospital waiting room like a woman I heard from last week, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from this morning. And if you believe a person's word ought to still mean something in this world, hit that like button before we get started. Now, before I tell you about that morning, you need to know who Walter Sims was to my family, because none of this makes sense otherwise. Walter had driven for my company for 19 years. Not as an employee exactly, not at first. He started out hauling loads for a competitor, and I used to see him at the same truck stop off Route 9, every Tuesday and Thursday, always the first one there. Always the one who'd back a rig into a tight dock better than men half his age. When my regular driver retired, I offered Walter the route without so much as a formal interview, just a handshake in a gravel parking lot, because I'd watched him for 2 years and I already knew everything about him that mattered. He never called in sick unless he was actually sick, and even then he'd have his nephew cover the route, so a customer never went a day without their delivery. He kept a laminated card taped inside his cab with every one of my grandkids' birthdays written on it, because he said a man ought to remember what mattered to the people who trusted him. Every single Christmas Eve for 19 years, without me ever once asking him to, he'd swing by my daughter's place on his way home and drop off a case of oranges, because his own mother used to do that for families back in Georgia, and he said it felt wrong to let that kindness die with her. I didn't understand until later just how much that small, steady habit of his was about to matter more than anything else in my life. My name is Harold Whitaker. I'm 68 years old. I built a regional trucking and freight company out of nothing but one flatbed truck and a line of credit from a bank that doubted me. And 41 years later, that company puts food on the table for 83 families, including my own. My late wife Dorothy used to say my one weakness, the thing that could undo me faster than any bad business deal, was that I trusted the people I loved the way other men trust the sunrise completely, without ever once checking to see if it was actually coming up where I expected. I signed things because a familiar signature was on the other line. I let my own son-in-law handle parts of the business I probably should have kept my own hands on. If somebody sat across my dinner table and called me family, that was the end of my questions, not the start of them. Dorothy passed 6 years ago, and since then, it's just been me in that big house on Cobblestone Lane outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with my daughter Melissa and her husband Craig living 20 minutes away, and my son Bradley, Dorothy's boy from her first marriage. But I never once thought of him as anything but mine, running the day-to-day operations at the company, the same operations I built with my own 2 hands, starting back when Bradley was still in diapers. That Tuesday morning, I was heading in early because we had a fleet inspection scheduled, and my hip had been bothering me the last few weeks, the kind of ache that makes a man start thinking about how many more mornings like this one he's actually got left in him. Walter texted me. That wasn't unusual on its own. Walter and I texted most mornings, mostly about weather and road conditions, and which exit was backed up. But this one was different. It said, "Mr. Whitaker, don't come to the office yet. Please call me before you leave your house." I stood there in my driveway reading it twice. I called him right back, and his voice, a voice I'd heard steady through blown tires and ice storms, and one bad accident on I-81 that could have killed him, was shaking in a way I'd never once heard from that man in 19 years. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "I need you to check the office cameras before you drive in. Please." I can't say more than that right now. I asked him what in God's name was going on. He wouldn't tell me. He just said, "Please, sir, check the cameras first." And then the line went dead, like he'd hung up in a hurry, or like somebody had walked up on him while he was talking. I went back inside, sat down at Dorothy's old kitchen table, and pulled up the security app on my phone with hands that weren't as steady as I would have liked them to be. We'd put cameras in the office and the warehouse 8 years back, after we'd had some equipment go missing off the lot. And truth be told, I hadn't looked at that feed in longer than I could remember. My office manager, a young man named Trent, usually handled anything that needed reviewing. I scrolled back to the overnight footage, my thumb hovering, my coffee sitting there on the table getting colder by the second. And there, in the grainy black and white of my own front office, at nearly 11 o'clock the night before, was my son Bradley, sitting at my desk. My desk, the one Dorothy bought me for my 50th birthday. The one with the brass nameplate that still says my name on it because I never had the heart to move it even after I stepped back from daily operations. And across from him, feet up on the corner of that desk like he owned the place, was my son-in-law Craig. Between them, spread out across the desk, were papers, stacks of them, and a leather folder I recognized instantly because it was mine, the one I kept locked in the file cabinet in my home office, the one with our company's title documents and the deed to the Cobblestone Lane property, the house Dorothy and I built together plank by plank back in 1987. I turned the volume up as far as it would go. The audio through that old camera system was thin and full of static, but I heard enough. I heard Craig say the word power of attorney twice. I heard Bradley laugh, and it wasn't his real laugh, the one I raised him to have. It was something flatter and colder. And he said, "The old man won't even question it. He never reads anything past the first paragraph anymore." I sat at that kitchen table for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 15 minutes, not moving, just watching my own boy's hand come down on a stack of paper, with my signature already printed at the bottom of pages. I never remembered signing. I want to be straight with you about something. I didn't throw that phone across the room. I didn't get in my truck and go tearing down there to have it out with them in the parking lot. Something in me went quiet in a way I'd never felt before. The kind of quiet that settles over a field right before a bad storm rolls in, not the kind that comes after. I called Walter back. He picked up on the first ring, like he'd been sitting there with the phone in his hand, waiting. "How long has this been going on, Walter?" I asked him. He was quiet for a second, and then he said, "I can't say for certain, Mr. Whitaker. I've seen Craig's car in that lot late a handful of times these past 2 months. Last night I was finishing up the evening route sheets, and I heard them talking through the office door, and I heard enough to know it wasn't business the company needed. I asked him why he'd take that kind of risk, calling me before I even walked into a building he didn't own, over a family matter that wasn't his to get tangled up in. He didn't answer right away, and when he did, he said something I've turned over in my mind every single day since. "Because you kept my name on that payroll every single week for 19 years, Mr. Whitaker. Even the year my wife was sick and I couldn't hardly work half my routes, and even the month you buried Miss Dorothy and forgot to sign half your own paperwork. Somebody in this outfit owes you the truth, and it might as well be me." I didn't go into that office that day. I told Trent I was feeling poorly and to reschedule the fleet inspection. I drove instead to a little diner out on Route 30 I hadn't sat in since before Dorothy passed, ordered a cup of coffee I never touched, and sat in that booth, going through everything Walter had sent me. He'd taken pictures of a notepad he kept in his cab, dates and times going back nearly 2 months, notes about Craig's car in the lot on nights nobody else was scheduled, a mention of paperwork he'd overheard called a revocable trust transfer, and something about moving the company's operating accounts into a name that wasn't mine before. In Craig's own words, that Walter had scratched down as best he could remember them, "The old man gets any sharper about where his money's going." Here's what I did not do. I did not march into that office and lay my fists on that desk. I did not call my daughter screaming into the phone. I sat with it. I let myself feel every bit of how much it hurt, because pretending it didn't would have made me a fool twice over, once for missing it these past months and once for rushing past it now. Wednesday morning, I called a woman named Deborah Voss, an attorney who'd handled my company's contracts and my estate planning for going on 15 years, ever since the trouble with my first business partner back in the 90s. I told her everything I'd seen and heard. She went quiet on her end of the phone for a good long moment, and then she asked me one question that changed the whole shape of what came next. "Harold, whose name is actually on the title to the company, and whose name is on the deed to Cobblestone Lane?" "Mine. Only mine." Dorothy and I had talked more than once, years back, about adding Bradley to the company's ownership structure, easing him into it the way a father does when he's hoping to hand something down someday. And it just never got done. Kept getting pushed to next year and then the year after that. That Wednesday morning, sitting in Deborah's office with the blinds half drawn, I understood for the first time that my own habit of putting things off had accidentally saved me. I didn't feel one bit of relief hearing that. I felt sick to my stomach, because it meant what was sitting on that desk in those camera images wasn't some innocent misunderstanding between a father and his boy. It was fraud, being drafted in real time, using a signature that wasn't mine to give. I spent the better part of the next 11 days living like a man who could see a storm building on the horizon and was counting the seconds between the lightning and the thunder that was bound to follow it. I didn't say one word to Bradley or to Melissa about what I knew. I kept showing up to Sunday dinner like always. I kept asking Bradley how the new hire out on the loading dock was working out, same as I always had. I watched him avoid looking at me straight on for more than a few seconds at a time, something I used to chalk up to him just being tired from the job, and now I was seeing with different eyes entirely. Craig stopped by the office twice more that week, both times when he thought I was up at the house resting my hip, except I wasn't resting anywhere. I was 2 blocks down in Walter's own truck, the two of us watching the security feed together on my phone, an old man and a truck driver keeping vigil like a couple of fools who'd finally figured out what mattered. Deborah worked fast, and she worked quiet. On day 3, she confirmed that the notary seal stamped on one set of those draft documents belonged to a small strip mall notary office that had been cited twice before by the state for exactly this kind of thing, backdating and forging. Signatures for a fee, no questions asked. On day 5, she turned up a business account opened under a company name I'd never heard of, registered to an address that turned out to be Craig's brother's rental property, with 2 modest transfers already sitting in it, small enough on paper to look like they'd been building up naturally over time rather than dropped in all at once to set a trap. On day 7, I moved. Quietly, the way a man moves when he's finally stopped being surprised by what people are capable of. I met with Deborah and restructured the entire ownership of the company into an irrevocable trust, not naming Bradley, not naming Craig, but naming my granddaughter Sophie, Melissa's oldest, who just turned 19 that August and had spent every summer since she was 12 riding along in Walter's cab, learning the routes, asking him more questions about the business than either of my own children ever had. I set it up so that trust couldn't be touched, sold, or transferred by anybody, including me, without Sophie's own signature. Once she turned 25, managed until then by Deborah as trustee, I sold the Cobblestone Lane property outright, the house Dorothy and I had built, to a young family Deborah found through a colleague, at a fair price, because I couldn't stand the thought of sleeping under that roof one more night not knowing who'd been walking through it plotting to take it. And with part of what that sale brought in, I did something I should have done years before, and never had I set up a fully funded standing account in Walter Sims's name, along with a letter making it plain in writing that his job and his family's security, and every bit of what he'd earned in 19 years, was never again going to hang on anybody's good graces but his own. I didn't do a single bit of this to punish my children out of spite. I did it because I finally understood that what a man builds needs to belong, on paper and in truth, to the people who've actually earned the right to hold it. The phone calls started on day 9. Bradley noticed the company's registered agent had changed. Melissa found out the Cobblestone Lane listing had gone up under a realtor she didn't recognize. 7 missed calls that first afternoon. By the next evening, 19, Craig called twice, though I didn't answer either time, and Deborah told me later he'd tried reaching her office directly, pretending to be handling things on my behalf, which told me everything I still needed to know about how far along his plans had really gotten. By the following morning, 31 missed calls between the 3 of them. None of them yet had any real idea how much I'd already moved. But they were about to. Saturday, October 25th, 7 o'clock in the evening. I finally called Bradley back and told him to come out to the house. Alone, no Craig, no Melissa, just him and me sitting down the way a father and son ought to be able to sit down. He came in already talking fast, already building some kind of story about a business restructuring plan he and Craig had been putting together as a surprise for my birthday, something about modernizing the ownership so I wouldn't have to worry so much anymore at my age. I let him finish. Then I laid the bank records out on Dorothy's kitchen table, one by one. Then the letter from the state about the notary office. Then the trust documents, already signed, already filed, with Sophie's name on every page. I never once raised my voice through any of it. It didn't need raising. He went quiet, staring down at that paperwork, and his face did something I don't believe I'd ever once seen it do in 38 years of being his father. Not anger exactly, more like watching a barn collapse in on itself from the inside while the roof was still holding its shape for one more second, right before it wasn't. "You had no right to do this without talking to me," he said. "I had every right," I told him. "It was mine to protect. It always was." He asked, quieter than I'd heard him speak in years, if there was any way back from where things stood between us. I told him the truth as plain as I knew how to say it. I told him I wasn't interested in cutting him out of my life forever, but I also wasn't going to pretend the last 11 days hadn't happened, and that trust doesn't rebuild itself just because somebody finally got caught. The company was protected in a way neither he nor Craig could reach. The house was already sold. Whatever the two of them had been planning to build together, they'd be building it from here on with their own hands, not mine. He left that night without another word. I heard, through people who still talk to both sides of a broken family the way people always seem to, that Craig lost his job not long after. Turns out a man who tries to open business accounts using forged authorization draws exactly the kind of attention nobody wants, even when the man he wronged decides against pressing charges out of whatever was left of 38 years of fatherhood. I didn't lift a finger to make any of that happen. I didn't need to. I still live outside Lancaster, in a smaller place now, closer to Sophie's college, so I can make her Sunday dinners when she's home on breaks. Walter still drives for the company, though these days it feels less like a man working for me and more like two old friends who've earned the right to trust each other completely, which I've come to learn is rarer in this life than almost anything else worth having. Every Christmas Eve, that case of oranges still shows up on Melissa's porch, because some habits are bigger than the trouble that surrounds them, and every single time I hear about it, I think back to that message buzzing against my porch railing on a cold Tuesday morning. I won't sit here and tell you I've forgiven everything. I haven't, and I'm not in any hurry to force it. What I will tell you is that I stopped needing one single thing from Bradley or from Craig to feel like my life and my company and my good name belonged to me again. That happened the day I signed Sophie's name onto that trust, not the day either one of them ever said they were sorry, because to this day, neither one of them really has. If there's one thing worth carrying away from an old man's story, it's that loyalty hardly ever comes announced with any kind of fanfare. Sometimes it's a truck driver with a notepad in his cab and 19 years of oranges on Christmas Eve, willing to risk the only job he's ever loved just to make sure you know the truth before it's too late to matter. Pay close attention to the people who show up for you quietly and consistently, year after year, long before you ever needed them to prove it. And if this story stirred up something in you tonight, hit that subscribe button and tell me down in the comments who's the Walter in your own life. The one who told you the truth when it would have been a whole lot easier for them to just stay quiet and let you find out on your own. I'd be glad to hear about them.